In 2009, a ridiculous case occurred in Suzhou. A man didn't come home all night, and his wife was very worried. The next morning, the wife found a strange car in her garage. Inside the car, her husband and a strange woman were lying disheveled. The wife was very angry when she saw it and knocked on the door to ask them to get out of the car, but no matter how hard she knocked, the people inside did not respond. It turned out that the husband had an affair with this strange woman in the car the night before. As a result, because the air conditioner was turned on and the windows were not opened, over time, they suffered carbon monoxide poisoning and both died. This incident caused quite a stir at the time and became a topic of conversation for everyone after dinner. It is said that there is a price to pay for cheating, but what many people don't know is that not long after this incident, another even more bizarre case occurred in Suzhou. The police investigation process can be said to have been full of twists and turns, and the final result is even more unbelievable. At noon on September 21, 2009, the Suzhou District Public Security Bureau of Suzhou City received an alarm call. The other party said that someone had died in a certain community on Huahua Street. The police rushed to the scene immediately. The reporter's surname is He, let's call him He. He said that at noon that day, he rode a bicycle alone to find his father-in-law and mother-in-law. To be precise, it was his former father-in-law and mother-in-law, because he had divorced the daughter of the old couple. However, there is still a connection between him and the old couple because they like their grandson very much. Just 2 days ago, the old couple called He and said they missed their grandson and wanted to take time to pick up their grandson from his home and stay at the old couple's home for 2 days. But after he waited at home for 2 days, his father-in-law and mother-in-law still did not come to pick up the child. So he called his father-in-law and mother-in-law several times at that time, but no one answered. At this time, he felt a little strange, so he came to the old couple's home to have a look. After arriving at the old man's door, he knocked on the door, but no one responded. The old couple's house is an old house, and the door is an old-fashioned iron fence-like security door. It has 2 floors. The outside is an iron security door, and the inside is a wooden door. At that time, he saw that the outermost iron gate was closed, but the wooden door inside was slightly open. Judging from this situation, there should usually be someone at this house, but why did no one answer after I knocked for a long time? He knocked for a while and called inside a few more times, but there was still no response. This made him feel more and more that something was wrong, so he called the police. The police arrived at the scene and forced their way inside, finding the situation inside very miserable. An elderly female deceased was lying on the floor of the living room, with a blood-stained wicker chair next to her. In the bedroom inside, a deceased male was lying on the floor. There were large bloodstains on the bedroom wall, and 2 drawers were pulled out and thrown to the floor. Both of the deceased were wearing pajamas, and it seemed that the crime occurred at night. But the strange thing is that at the scene, in addition to the corpses and bloodstains on the ground, there was even a lot of water on the walls, as if it had been rained on. After He Mao's identification, the 2 deceased persons were He Mao's ex-father-in-law and mother-in-law, the 72-year-old male Gua and the 68-year-old female Zhang. The forensic doctor first conducted a preliminary autopsy on the old lady Zhang and found a total of 3 stab wounds on her body, all of which were concentrated on the back of the neck and back. The police speculated that the murderer suddenly attacked the old lady from behind while she was resting on a wicker chair. Besides, the old man's body in the bedroom must have been injured while he was resting. There were multiple stab wounds on his arms, chest, and back. The bedding on the bed also had many marks of being punctured by sharp knives, as well as a large amount of blood. After examining the wounds of the 2 deceased people, the forensic doctor determined that the murder weapon used to kill the 2 elderly people was the same. The deceased both died of hemorrhagic shock and the time of death had exceeded 24 hours. As for the situation of the 2 deceased people, the police first noticed that the 2 old men were in a relaxed state before they were killed. One was leaning on a recliner and the other was lying on the bed. They did not seem to be aware of the danger, or they should have been unable to foresee the danger at the time. At the same time, the police checked the doors and windows of the home and found that they were all closed and not damaged, and there were no obvious signs of climbing outside. So this means that the murderer should have entered through the front door. In addition, there were a lot of water stains at the scene. It was obvious that the murderer washed the scene after committing the crime in an attempt to eliminate his own traces. But this criminal was obviously in a hurry, or he didn't have much awareness of counter-investigation, because he didn't clean the scene thoroughly, he just rushed. For the police, this is certainly a good thing. After careful investigation, the police finally found some footprints in the living room and bedroom that did not belong to the deceased, so the footprints might have been left by the murderer. But the strange thing is that after identification, it was found that although these footprints did not belong to the deceased, they came from a pair of slippers at home. This pair of slippers is placed in the shoe cabinet. This is interesting. The criminal was wearing the family's slippers and put them back in the shoe cabinet after committing the crime. When he committed the crime, he took advantage of the elderly to relax and committed the crime while they were resting. When these characteristic points are combined, it is obvious that this is a crime committed by an acquaintance. Frequently, acquaintances commit crimes not simply for money. The items in the old man's home were neatly arranged, and the gold necklace and rings on the deceased were also there. Only 2 drawers in the bedroom were opened. Judging from the situation, it's certainly not about the money. So what was the murderer's purpose? He opened the drawer. Was he looking for something? Now that it is determined that an acquaintance committed the crime, the police investigation has a direction. Through investigation, it was found that the social relationship between the 2 old people was very simple. They are all from Shanghai. They came to Suzhou in their early years and worked in a local thermal power plant before retiring. According to neighbors, although the 2 old men have lived in Suzhou for decades, they have very few messy friends. Therefore, when they are at home, in addition to spending time with their families, they usually go to drink tea and chat with their neighbors. Therefore, their social circle is very small, and the old couple has lived in this community for many years. Their relationship with the neighbors is very good, and there is no possibility of vendetta. So after going around, the social circle of the old couple can be said to be clean and pure. Since the people in these social circles outside have no problems, the police can only turn their attention from the outside to the inside and check the family members of the 2 old people. They have a son and a daughter. The son works in Shanghai and comes back occasionally. The daughter's name is Susan, who works locally in Suzhou. She usually takes care of the elderly. And the person who reported the crime, he, was naturally the ex-husband of Susan Sean. Although the 2 have divorced, their ex-husband he still has contact with the old couple because they have a child. In addition, he was the first to arrive at the scene of the crime, so this he was also included in the police's sight, and he was considered to be a certain suspect. Because this is an old community, there are no surveillance cameras inside the community. There is only one installed at the gate of the community. The police retrieved the surveillance video and soon discovered an important clue. It was discovered that 2 days before the incident, that is, on the morning of September 19th, an old lady came in from the gate with a basket of vegetables in her hand. Although the surveillance was a bit blurry, several neighbors and their daughter Susan Sean recognized that the old lady in the picture was the deceased. After this old lady came back this time, she never left the house again. Therefore, based on this video, we can compress the time when the 2 elderly people were killed and roughly determine the time of their death. It should be from noon on September 19th as shown in the surveillance to noon on September 21st when the crime occurred. And because the medical examiner determined that the deceased had been dead for more than 24 hours, the time could be pushed back 1 day. Therefore, the deceased's time of death was fixed at noon on September 19th to noon on September 20th. At the same time, because the elderly were wearing pajamas when they were killed, the time of their murder can be further limited to night. There was only 1 night between noon on September 19th and noon on September 20th, so the time of their murder must have been between the night of September 19th and the early morning of September 20th. With the specific time in hand, the police then began to investigate the timelines of all suspects. The first is the person who reported the crime, he, who is the deceased's former son-in-law. Let's recall that before the incident, he called the old man several times, but no one answered. For safety reasons, he came to the scene alone to inquire about the situation. This process sounds to us like there should be no problem, but if we think about it carefully, after discovering that there was an abnormality in the old man's home, the first thing he thought of was not to call his ex-wife Susan, but to come to the scene alone to check and report it directly. Police. This process sounds like something is wrong. To be honest, they were all divorced and no longer a family. Even if he really suspected that something had happened to the old man, and even if he really wanted to come to the scene to see it in person, he should inform their children of this matter as soon as possible. But he didn't do that. He came directly to the scene. The police secretly investigated and learned that he was 38 years old and from Suzhou. The reason why Susan Sean and he divorced was because of personality differences. They often quarreled after getting married, so they separated. But the old couple are actually firmly opposed to Susan Shan's divorce, and the old couple are actually very good to he and like this son-in-law very much. Moreover, when their daughter Susan Sean filed for divorce, the couple both turned their elbows outward and tried their best to protect he and prevent them from getting divorced. It is precisely for this reason that he maintains close contact with the 2 elderly people. In addition, the old man's son works out of town, so the old couple treats he directly as their own son. From this perspective, it seems reasonable that he came directly to the scene without notifying Susan. The old man's neighbors also confirmed that he and the old couple had always had a very good relationship and often bought things for the old man. If you look at it this way, he seems to have no motive for committing the crime. But there was a strange problem at this time. When he called the police, he directly said that someone had died. At that time, he hadn't gone in, or seen inside. How did he know that someone was dead? He gave an explanation for this. He said that although the outermost iron door was locked at the time, the wooden door inside was slightly open. Through this crack, he saw that there seemed to be bloodstains in the living room, and he felt that something was wrong. As for why he didn't call his ex-wife, it was because there was almost no contact between the two, and he didn't want to take the initiative to provoke him. From this point of view, his explanation is relatively reasonable, so the police have temporarily ruled out his suspicion. So besides he, who else can successfully enter the elderly's home and make the elderly completely relax their vigilance? Naturally, the police thought of his ex-wife and the deceased's daughter Susan. There are other reasons for thinking of her. Because Susan has been the only one taking care of the two elderly people in Suzhou, and her brother has been in Shanghai. So if the old man dies, Susan should get more inheritance. So, did Susan Shan kill someone because she was eager to get the old man's inheritance? This possibility is not impossible. Under normal circumstances, when committing crimes against one's relatives, in addition to inheritance, there may also be murder and insurance fraud. However, police investigation revealed that the inheritance of the two old men was not much. The only valuable thing in the house was the scene of the crime. The house was only worth about 500,000 yuan. Secondly, the two elderly people did not buy insurance, so there was no possibility of insurance fraud. From this point of view, Susan seems to have no motive when it comes to money. But just in case, the police still investigated Susan Shan's movements on the day the old man was killed. It has been previously speculated that the time when the old man was killed should be from the night of September 19th to the early morning of September 20th. So where was Susan Shan during this time? After investigation, we learned that at noon on September 19th, Susan Shan and her friends drank tea in a tea house. Both friends and tea house waiters can testify. She then went to pick up her children from school, as the teacher and janitor could also testify. After sending the child home, it was 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and then she went back to work overtime. During this period, she and a colleague worked overtime until 2 o'clock in the morning. This colleague was named Jiang Weihua. The police found Jiang Weihua, and the other party said that Susan Shan had indeed been working overtime with him. From this point of view, during the time period when the crime occurred, Susan Shan had no time to commit the crime, so her suspicion could only be ruled out. Both he and Susan were eliminated as suspects, so now only the son of the old couple who works in Shanghai is left. The son's name is Su Chang. According to reports from neighbors, the son of the old couple seldom comes over because he is quite busy with work. In addition, because Su Chang was sent to his grandparents' home in Shanghai when he was a child, he has been living with his grandparents and is relatively estranged from his parents. In addition, the police also learned that Su Chang still had some problems. A few years ago, Su Chang came to borrow money from two old people many times, but they were rejected by the old people. At that time, the two parties had fierce quarrels and conflicts, and finally broke up. So, did Su Chang kill his biological parents because of money issues? In order to find out the truth, the Suzhou police immediately contacted the Shanghai police and launched an investigation into Su Chang's specific whereabouts during the time of the crime. But the final result was disappointing again. On September 19th, Su Chang had been working in the company. He went drinking and singing with his colleagues in the evening, and did not go back until the next morning. He had never been there at all. Suzhou. Therefore, Su Chang's suspicion was also eliminated. At this point, the people around the deceased have been excluded, which makes the police feel a little confused. How to proceed next? The police can only pin their hopes on a secondary investigation of the scene. Because the site was washed by water, it was very difficult to investigate. After 3 days of careful inspection, good news finally came. A very shallow fingerprint with bloodstains was found on the doorframe of the bedroom. Because it was washed by water, the police had not found it during the previous investigation. It was not until the water stains dried that it gradually appeared. After comparison, it was found that the bloody fingerprint did not belong to the deceased, so it most likely belonged to the murderer. Therefore, the police immediately extracted the fingerprints of he, Susan, Su Chang, and neighbors and friends who had close contact with the old man. After final comparison, a result that surprised everyone emerged. This fingerprint came from his daughter Susan. This brought Susan Shan into the police's sight again. Her bloody fingerprints were found at the scene. This was definitely no accident, so the police launched a more in-depth investigation into her. Susan Shan's personal experience is relatively complicated. After she divorced she worked many jobs in other provinces. Later, she could no longer survive outside and returned to Suzhou. After returning to her parents, she worked as a beer agent in Suzhou. Although her income was not bad, she had to take care of her parents and had a lot of expenses, so she had almost no balance and was still tight. During this period, Susan Shan also found a new boyfriend. The two had a good relationship and Susan Shan liked each other very much. The police also investigated the identity of the new boyfriend and found that his name was Jiang Weihua. The name Jiang Weihua made everyone feel very familiar. After thinking about it carefully, everyone suddenly thought that the colleague who worked overtime with Susan Shan on the night of the incident was named Jiang Weihua, wasn't he? This discovery made the police feel a little strange. They were obviously lovers. Why did Susan Shan only say that she and Jiang Weihua were colleagues during the previous investigation? Is she hiding something? Faced with the police's questioning, Susan Shan said that because she and Jiang Weihua met online, and the other party was also divorced, for years younger than Susan Shan, and even very poor. With such conditions, she was afraid that her parents would look down on her, so she kept "I didn't tell my parents." Since there has been no official announcement yet, naturally I have not told the police. This reason sounded okay, but then, during the subsequent investigation, the police discovered that Susan had lied again. In fact, Jiang Weihua and Susan Shan have known each other for a long time, and they are already planning to get married. The two old men not only knew about this matter for a long time, but also firmly opposed it. After all, there was a 4-year age difference between them. They felt that Jiang Weihua had other motives for being together with their daughter. Therefore, the police speculated that Jiang Weihua killed the two elderly people just to be with Susan Shan. Susan Shan may have learned about this incident later, but because she was already in love and couldn't extricate herself, she finally decided to help Jiang Weihua bury the truth of the crime, so she concealed their relationship when facing police investigation. In this way, it all seems to make sense. Based on the above speculation, the police launched an investigation into Jiang Weihua, but at this time the case took a strange turn. Police investigation found that Jiang Weihua and Susan Shan were colleagues. At the same time, Jiang Weihua also opened an advertising company of his own. It seemed that his career was going well, but in fact, his company had been losing money, the business was very bad, and he had little money. Moreover, this Jiang Weihua has an impulsive personality and was once dealt with by the police for fighting. But Susan Shan didn't seem to care about this. She was devoted to Jiang Weihua and even used her own savings to subsidize Jiang Weihua's company many times. In addition, the police also learned of an unusual situation. Although Jiang Weihua had divorced his ex-wife long ago and was single when he fell in love with Susan Shan, he suddenly remarried his ex-wife just a few months before the incident. And Susan Shan didn't seem to know about this. On the surface, it seems to have nothing to do with the case, but he can exactly prove that Jiang Weihua's feelings for Susan Shan are not that good, and they have not yet reached the point of giving up. On the contrary, Susan Shan could not live without Jiang Weihua. This actually means that since Jiang Weihua doesn't like Susan Shan that much and even misses his ex-wife, there is no need for him to commit murder. Then the previous speculation was wrong. Jiang Weihua had no reason to kill Susan Shan's parents, so his suspicion plummeted. Similarly, just because Jiang Weihua had no reason, Susan Shan's suspicion rose again. We thought that since the two people were in a relationship, Jiang Weihua might not have told the truth when he was questioned by the police. After all, they were lovers, so they still had feelings, and they might have been covering for each other. So the police came to Susan Shan's company again and found the doorman on duty that night. The guard said that on the night of September 19th, when the old man was killed, he did see Jiang Weihua and Susan Shan working overtime in the company. So since the guard saw it, it means that Susan Shan really did not have time to commit the crime that night. But the problem is that Susan Shan's fingerprints did appear at the scene, and they were also stained with blood. As for his relationship with Jiang Weihua, he did lie to the police. No matter how you look at it, this Susan is somewhat suspicious. After much deliberation, since there were really no clues to be found, the police decided to directly interrogate Susan Shan. During the interrogation, Susan did not admit that she was the murderer. Regarding the fingerprint, she said that it was in her own home after all, and it was of course normal to leave fingerprints in her own home. The fingerprint belonged to Susan Shan's left thumb. With a rigorous attitude, the police examined Susan Shan's left thumb and found a wound on the thumb. Susan Shan said that it was accidentally scratched while cooking a few days ago. Then there is a wound on the thumb and there is blood on the fingerprint, which just explains all these things. But if what Susan Shan said is true, then the bloodstains on the bloody fingerprints must be Susan Shan's own. But when the police tested the bloodstains, the results showed that the bloodstains on the fingerprints came from her father. Apparently, Susan lied again. Faced with such irrefutable evidence, Susan finally stopped making excuses and admitted her crime. Everyone couldn't believe that the baby girl in their parents' eyes turned out to be the devil who killed them. But Susan Shan said that everything she did was for her boyfriend Jiang Weihua. What happened is this: back then, Susan Shan went out to explore alone, but the reality was cruel. She traveled to several cities and achieved nothing, so she had no choice but to return to Suzhou. That period was the most frustrating and gloomy period in her life. At that time, she met Jiang Weihua. Jiang Weihua was very good at talking, and often used various tricks to comfort Susan and make her happy. Susan Shan fell into it, and during the long-term relationship, the relationship between the two gradually heated up. Finally, Jiang Weihua proposed the idea of getting married to her. However, faced with Jiang Weihua's proposal, Susan Shan hesitated. Although she wanted to get married, the two of them had no house, no car, and no savings. This was the most unacceptable thing for Susan. So she refused. Unexpectedly, Jiang Weihua actually made a damaging move for her at this time. He told Susan Shan, "When your parents die, won't their house and money belong to you? Although the house is a bit old, it can still be sold for hundreds of thousands." Maybe Susan Shan loved Jiang Weihua too deeply. After Jiang Weihua's repeated persuasion, Susan Shan actually had the idea of killing her parents. Under the huge temptation, she planned for a long time and prepared a fruit knife and 2 boxes of sleeping pills. At noon on September 18th, Susan Shan came to the old man's house on the pretext of delivering food to her parents and mixed sleeping pills into the food. About an hour later, my mother dozed off on the wicker chair and my father fell asleep in the bedroom. So she took out a fruit knife and stabbed her mother and father. After the murder, in order to fake the scene, she pulled out 2 drawers, fell to the floor, and flushed the room with water. But as everyone knows, some traces are not so easy to erase. This is how she committed the crime. But we can find a detail here. The time she committed the crime was September 18th, but why was her mother captured in the surveillance footage on September 19th? Everyone is dead, how did she appear on the surveillance camera? In fact, this problem is thanks to those enthusiastic neighbors. Because the surveillance screen is relatively blurry, you can't actually see it clearly. After the neighbors saw the picture, they saw that the old lady's figure looked very similar, and they all said that she was the deceased. But that's not the case at all. They were wrong. The old lady in the surveillance room is someone else. As for Susan, she could tell at a glance that it was not her mother, but the neighbors said it was her, so they went down the slope and misled the police, saying that it was her mother. In this way, the police misjudged the time when the old couple was killed. Finally, on December 27, 2009, the Suzhou Intermediate People's Court ruled that Susan was guilty of intentional homicide and sentenced to death. A few days ago, we just talked about an unfilial son, Xiao Lei, who forced his mother to commit the crime of embezzling public funds. Today, Susan Shan is undoubtedly even more hateful. That boyfriend of hers isn't a good guy either. When we encounter such people in the future, we should stay away from them as soon as possible and break up as soon as possible. We must not take it lightly.